Welcome to Doc NYC's Spring Showcase, our mid-year celebration of documentary films and series. I'm Brandon Harrison, Senior Programmer at Doc NYC. It's my pleasure to be speaking with Matthew Hamachek, who's Director of Apple's The Dynasty, the New England Patriots. Matt, how's it going, man?
It's good. Thank you so much for having me.
Excited to chat with you. I'm a big sports guy. Love everything about sports docs. I am curious for you early, the beginning, before you're really in the weeds. Are you a big fan? What was the interview process like getting this kind of job? Like, what was excitement like on your end?
Well, it's interesting. I didn't grow up a Patriots fan at all. I think like, every other fan in the NFL, we were constantly getting beat by them. So I wasn't a huge fan. But the one thing that I did know was that, they always kept everybody at arm's length, right? The normal sort of the window into the Patriots was Bill Belichick standing up at a lectern saying, we're on to Cincinnati or something like that. And so I think there was a couple of different things that were really important to me. One was, how are we going to make them really let us into what it was like to be inside those walls as this thing was unfolding over the course of 20 plus years. And then also, you know, just as a fan of documentary, but also of sports, you don't want this to be a puff piece. This had to be the unvarnished telling of the New England Patriots story. And I think that those two things at the beginning, before I really got to talk to anybody, were the things that were really important to me.
In that sense, I mean, it's based upon Jeff Benedict's book. Did you speak with him a lot? What was that process like? I mean, you're going from a tome of a story to like break it out into a documentary that's palatable for people. What was it like your working relationship with him and like that
Yeah.
process?
Well, Jeff is incredible, and we had collaborated on Tiger, for HBO shortly before working on this one. And at the end of that, that's when he said, "Hey, I'm writing this book about the Patriots. Would you be interested in directing it if it becomes a doc series?" And I said, "Yeah," because I thought that there was something interesting about the Patriots and their ruthlessness and sort of this question of like what makes greatness? How do you get there? How do you sustain it? All of this. There was so much about them that was unknown. So I thought that was going to be an interesting challenge. But in terms of how you take a book and turn it into a doc, I think anybody that's made one of these before, and it's, based off of a book, they know that you can't take a book and feed the pages into a machine and spit out a documentary. You really have to start from scratch in a lot of ways. And that applied to this one so many different ways, in that, we didn't follow the story structure. The different events, obviously, in terms of the football of it, were very similar. But I think the main difference was really, this question of what is our central theme? What is the thing that we're going after? Because we're not going to do what Jeff's book did really well, which was do sort of the chronology of the Patriot story. We're not going to have the time to do something like that. And what is the central theme that we're chasing?
And for those, that are watching this and decompressing and they're 3, 4 odd hour long journey with the Patriots. What is the central theme? Like, what would you
Yeah.
say it is? What's the core? I feel like there's a lot of themes in it, a lot of
Yes.
different ways, different motifs through it. But like for you, what's the main center of that bullseye?
So everybody that's watched knows Ernie Adams, the director of football research, which in an organization that is known for not letting anybody in, Ernie is even more secretive than that. Within the organization, he's known as sort of the most secretive man out there. But he was, after one phone call, really was willing to talk to me, and I think I did about 15 hours of interviews with him. But the first one, he sat down and he said, every team at the beginning of the year says they want to go to the Super Bowl, but not every team is willing to do what it takes to get there. And when he said that, that was sort of a light bulb moment, in terms of maybe that's the question that we're going to be trying to answer in this one, because in each film, it's obviously different. But the what does it take to get there and sustain it became the guiding principle of everything on this. And in that, you find incredible beauty, and you find things that are complicated and people that are complicated, and I think that's really, really important when you're trying to tell the unvarnished story of the New England Patriots.
Pardon me. Well, like in that sense, there's a lot of narratives to suss out here. What would you say was your decision making process to say we're not going to do this, we're not going to do this, we're going to
Yeah.
square this circle a bit?
Yeah, I think that in all the projects I've worked on, especially as a director, but also as a writer, producer, editor, prior to directing, I think once you have that central question, that really frees you up to tell a story and to choose what events you are going to cover based off of this thing has to answer that central question or that theme that you're trying to figure out. And so, the first three episodes of this thing were how did they get to their first one and what did it take? And in that case, it was really about the genius of Coach Belichick, of seeing something in a person that was working for him that nobody else really saw, and that was Tom Brady. And that decision and all the pressure that it was that came with it, and everybody sort of thinking that it was a horrible choice and all these things, but Bill Belichick having, I think, the ability to sort of block all that out and just say, even in and even the fact that he had gone through that before in Cleveland, where he had chosen to make a decision at quarterback that was very controversial. It didn't necessarily go the way that it did here, and he stuck to his guns, and it proved obviously to be one of the greatest coaching decisions in NFL history. So that was sort of the first part about it, and then once we saw the team get to the top and sort of obtain that, there was this, we were constantly debating, okay, well, they've won six Super Bowls. Are we going to show every single one of these? Is that what we're really going to do? We're going to make everybody say like, okay, and they basically did the same thing with different pieces, and it's interesting, but are we going to show the second and the third? And it felt, as we started to build those episodes, that we were kind of treading water a little bit, that we were going over the same sort of building blocks that get you to the point where you feel like a dynasty or you've gotten to the top of the mountain. And so I think because of that, because it didn't feel like we were progressing the question, we decided to move past those two Super Bowls, get to the point where they're the dynasty, and then focus on this period where the team wasn't winning Super Bowls, and that's sort of the middle section of the story. And then the third part of it is really when they get back to winning. But interestingly, as they win, the dynasty starts to unfold and really fall apart at the seams. So to me, sort of thinking of it in those three blocks and making sure that we were constantly doing something new. I worked for a director when I was starting out, Marshall Curry, and he had a little yellow sticky note on his computer that says "What happens next?" and the way it applies to this idea of the central theme and the central question is, you kind of want the audience always saying, I didn't know that. What happens next? What's new that I haven't learned yet, right? And I think that that's sort of how we use the central question for this one, but also, on Tiger, the central question, the theme, or whatever you want to call it, was Tiger is this canvas that everybody around him wanted to paint onto and wanted to put what they wanted him to be onto him. And so that was the guiding principle for that one. And I think in a lot of ways, the hardest part about making these documentaries, whether it's about sports or whether it's about somebody like Amanda Knox, which I did with Brian McGinn for Netflix a few years back, once you find those central questions, you're freed up because you're not worried about which games you're covering anymore, or what plot points you're covering, as much as you are trying to say, what about this story speaks to that larger thing that's universal, that goes beyond whatever the subject matter is, whether it's true crime or sports or anything else.
You mentioned it in the terms of the structure about bumping over sort of the later two of the first group
The
of
second and
Super
third, yeah,
Bowls.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And like for me as a viewer, the sense of discovery around that beginning era was awesome. Like I really, really enjoyed that, especially for someone that's kind of caught up in the contemporariness of everything that we know about the story and
yeah,
all the things that are happening. It's like, all right, let's go back to 2000.
yeah,
What is going on here? Who are these characters? Can you tell me about like what you really wanted to show at that early period? I mean,
yeah.
stylistically through the archive. because it's like you said, or we've got this guy, this maybe good up and coming smart coach, but there's a lot of questions there.
Well, I think the important thing is to, there are many approaches to how you do a 10-part series, right? For me, one of the things that was really important to this, because I'm always a fan of doing less, right? I'm always an advocate for doing the 90-minute, feature length story in general. And so one of the things that I've always sort of felt when people do 10-part series or something, eight, whatever it is that I don't know. You don't want to just fill time for the sake of filling time, and you also don't want to do it in a way where each episode feels like an island unto itself, right? So it's like episode one, in some cases, and things I've watched, doesn't speak to episode two, and what I wanted to do in this story was really to have it feel like an arc that had a beginning, middle, and end over the course of 8 hours or whatever it ended up being. And so one of the things that was important to me was that, like you said, you were sort of caught up in the contemporariness of this story. And when you come in, you're like, well, this is a story about the greatest player of all time and the greatest coach of all time. And that's what we're going to get. And what I wanted to do is to show that in reality, um, in 2000, Bill Belichick was not the greatest coach of all time, and Tom Brady was a nobody. And I think that in a lot of ways, showing them in that situation, because they had to change and evolve, and this story did have to arc over so much time. And as so many people say in that this first few episodes, he wasn't Tom Brady the GOAT, he was just Tommy. And I think the same is for Bill Belichick. This wasn't a guy who people were, putting up on their shoulders as a great coach, even a good coach necessarily. He had that, as Jackie Mack puts it in the series, an underwhelming stint in Cleveland, and he really had to prove himself. And I think it puts so much more perspective and of the pressure that was on his shoulders when he chose to go with Tom Brady over the $100 million quarterback, and how great of a choice that was, despite what basically everybody out there was saying at the time. And so I think starting out and showing them in that light, and what they were going through, and always using these flashbacks to previous times as a way to sort of elucidate what's going on in the A story, is really, really important. And it also frees you up to not have to cover all that stuff. It means you don't have to cover every single game. When we go back and we see a backstory about Tom Brady in episode 2, when we come back in, we're not at the next game in the series of that season. We're a couple games ahead, because that's where he's changed, and the things that we learned about him in the backstory are showing up in the A story finally. And so it's that kind of stuff, that kind of storytelling, that really interests myself and the team of people we had working with us.
Speaking of team of people, I was most compelled by David Nugent.
Yes.
And is it like, hey, we're on an archival journey. Ask everyone on the team what they've got. Oh, you have your Tommy's roommate. You have a camcorder? What's going
Yeah,
on?
I wish
Like,
it was
what is
that.
the
I wish it worked like that. I wish one, that we were thinking that way, and two, that we just somehow knew that he would have had it. But Chris James, our producer, um, he did a lot of pre-interviews with people before they got into the chair, just to see like what they were good talking about, and like what stories they had to tell, things like that. And in his pre-interview with David Nugent, and he had basically tracked down David Nugent out of nowhere. I don't think David Nugent's been in any of the docs that have ever been made about the Patriots, or any of the NFL film stuff, or any of the Patriots stuff. And he called him up, and while he was doing the pre-interview, I think Dave said, "Oh, by the way, I've got this home video footage of me and Tom when we were living together in this condo." And we go back to this question of, how do you show that Tom was just Tommy, right? And that footage, more than anything else, shows what he was really like, and gives you a window into how he talked, to what he looked like before the hundreds of millions of dollars came into the picture and everything else. So no, that archive was incredible. And David sort of brought it with him to the interview, and gave us like a flash drive or something, and just said, "Yeah, I don't know if you guys want this, but it might be good." And it was just like, it was a gold mine. So it was one of those days when the documentary gods were blessing us.
Yeah, that stuff was amazing. Like really, really, really compelling. I think in that sense, well, not only the archive that you got for him, but just like him as a character, he was amazing. Was there anyone else that was just like a real surprise in the chair, or like their insights were like, hey, I was not expecting this from X?
To be perfectly honest, I think Tom Brady was one of those. I mean, there were dozens, right? I mean, the one thing you know about the Patriots, if you've watched a single press conference or anything about them ever, is that they don't really let you in. So every time you sat down with anybody, it was like, oh my gosh, this happened. Oh, and this happened. Oh my, and you start to peel back these layers of the story that really have never gotten out there before because of how sort of curated everything that came out of Patriot Place was. And that was by design. And I don't think there was a better example of that than Tom Brady. I think people have seen him over the years, and he's very calculated in the way he does press and what he says. In fact, there was an episode of The Shop where he even said something like 95% of what I say isn't true or something to that effect, right? And so I really wanted to make sure that we got a different version of Tom than people had seen before. And I think that what he gave us was a very vulnerable version of Tom Brady who really let us in. And to his credit, I was thinking, oh man, this guy's going to show up and he's going to have hair and makeup and a PR rep who's going to sit behind my shoulder and say, oh, you can't ask him about Deflategate or stuff like that. And he drove himself to the studio in his car, got out, sat in the chair, and just said, hey, what do you want to know? And that was it. So it was really interesting to watch him.
That's really amazing. I think on the flip side, I guess that the question is, what's it like interviewing Bill Belichick?
Yeah, yeah.
Because
No,
you don't see that as much in the footage, but as everyone says, behind the scenes, maybe he's a more jovial sort of character.
yeah, and I think you get glimpses of that, right? Like obviously there were times I think that the thing that you have to understand about Bill is that if there's something he wants to talk about, he can be great, right? If you watch when he was doing a speech at Dante Scarnecchia's retirement ceremony, or Hall of Fame induction rather, uh, this past year. And when he wants to turn it on, he can turn it on. And we got that, in the Lawyer Malloy hotel room story and in the story about Randy Moss coming to the Patriots and him calling Randy in a club and the two of them sort of bouncing off of each other. When he wants to do that, he's great at it. But when you ask the tough questions that need to be asked, he sort of falls back on what he does at press conferences. But I think the interesting thing here is that in the press conferences, he's on an island, right? And there's nobody else talking around him. So when he says, we're on to Cincinnati or whatever the answer is at that time, that's it. But when it's bouncing off of the players or that are talking and the other coaches that are talking, people like Ernie, people like Scott Pioli, it brings new meaning to his answers. And so I think, we got a bunch of different sides out of Bill.
If you sit down, you say, hey, you call people up, we're doing the
Yeah,
complete history of New England Patriots.
unvarnished.
What are their reactions? I mean, obviously you have your Brady's, your Belichick's, but like when you send that a call, are people excited? Are they a little nervous? Or are there people willing to be like, hey, I'm ready to spill? What was the general mix? So there were some cool examples around that.
I think it was all different. I mean, we interviewed 70 plus people, right? So it's you can imagine everybody's different, and there are vast swings from one side to the other, and then there are also small adjustments from person to person. But when we did Tiger, it was the opposite of this one, right? We didn't have anybody inside the inner circle of Tiger, so we didn't have access to Tiger. We didn't have access to his managers, his coaches, etc. So, but the interesting thing is that the process is very similar. You call people up and you say, hey, we're doing this thing. And they say, well, okay, well, how am I going to be portrayed? And my answer is always the same thing. The truth of who we are lies somewhere between the hit piece and the puff piece. And it's not going to be what you would do if you had full control over this. And it's not going to be what, your worst enemy would make about you. And in between those two things normally lies the truth about everybody. And then beyond that, everybody had different things. Some people, like Adam Vinatieri, was sort of saying that, he gets requests like this all the time to do things about the Patriots, but is Tom going to be in it? Is Bill going to be in it? Is Robert going to be in it? And then the other thing for him was, is this going to be the actual unvarnished telling of the story? Because you have to remember, Adam went to Indianapolis afterwards and played for another team that was and continued to be the rival of the Patriots. And he was on the team when Deflategate happened. So he didn't want to see another puff piece, which is basically what we've been getting about the Patriots for, 20 plus years, is the puff piece about them over and over again in documentary form. And so there was a bunch of different things like that. And the process for me, once I got them in the chair, was really just listening to them, because that's the thing, is we can guess what was going on inside those walls, and people have tried to do that in pieces the Patriots released, pieces that NFL has released, or books that had been written, whatever. But a lot of those times they were doing it with anonymous sources, and you didn't know, is this the guy who's emptying the wastebaskets at night, or is this like Tom, Bill, the people who are actually there doing the things? And so we had this opportunity, and so I just said, okay, I'm just going to ask questions and sit back and let them tell me what really happened. And that was freeing in a lot of ways, because I got to listen instead of coming in and saying like, oh, I know what this is supposed to be. And because I wasn't a fan, I wasn't saying like, hey, I have this memory of this game being really important because I sat on my couch, with my family watching this when I was 12 years old. It was just, what really happened here, and how are we going to answer that central question?
I think a big part of like the reception of this is like squaring that triangle of Bill, Tom, and Robert Kraft. I feel like how do you take that? People had their own opinions about that. There's a lot of opinions about this person's perspective is more important. This person's
Right, right,
perspective is
right.
more important. Like, how have you handled that? What do you have to say to that to people who have their feelings about it in ever which direction?
My answer is that I had the central question to answer, and that was basically the only thing that I was trying to do. And I think that, you know, as I got closer and closer to that over the time, and over understanding like how all of their relationships started, how they changed over time, and how they eventually led to the unraveling of the dynasty, that was sort of the arc that we were going to be following. And as long as what we were covering answered that central question of what does it take to get there year in and year out, and always be competing and dealing with all sorts of things that are very human and go way beyond the football field, then it was good for the show. And if it wasn't, then we weren't covering it.
Very, very well said. I think a big part of that, and it's not the story of just Tom Brady or just Bill Belichick or whomever, um, is getting those emotional moments. I just want to like rewind a bit to what you said about Tom being surprising. Were you gonna expect that after you talked to his family? Did you talk to them first or him first? Like
I
I'm
think
interested about that because you got a lot of
yeah,
perspective on him from them.
yeah, no, and first off, I think his family were some of the most, sort of underrated people in the entire doc series, because they really gave an insight to him as a human being. And that's always the hardest thing when you're telling stories about anybody, right? Whether it's like, if you were doing something about Silicon Valley, it's like, how do you actually humanize the people that are the titans of industry, or in this case, these people who are the greatest of all time at what they do? They've been built up by everybody around them, partly intentionally, for branding purposes, to be these godlike figures. And what you want to do is show their humanity and what makes them human. And so I think his family did an incredible job at doing that. But I think, if you spend any time with Tom Sr., his father, you realize that the men in that family are emotional in a great way, and really like wear their emotions on their sleeve. And so when I had talked to Tom Sr., and then when Tom Jr. got in the chair, it was, I wasn't as shocked by the emotion that he showed in some of those moments. But if you notice, one thing that's really interesting is that relationship with Bill is obviously one of the more complicated ones between Tom and Bill in the entire series, right? But if you notice at the end, the two moments in episode 10 where he really starts to get choked up and cry are when he's talking about what Bill meant to him and having to say goodbye to Bill. And so I thought that, you know, those kind of moments and letting them play out exactly as they happened, rather than sort of holding the audience's hand and sort of saying like, here, watch this. This is really important. What does this say about their relationship? Just saying, this is going to play itself out. And some people are going to see that and they're going to register that, and some people aren't. But that's okay. That's sort of the kind of, whenever I'm making a doc, what I always say is, what are the kind of docs that I like to watch? And I think I grew up on the sort of old school verite documentaries where you had the least amount of hand holding possible. You barely even had like lower thirds or chyrons or whatever that told you who the people were. And that's the style that I like, where you let things go out into the world, and some people watch them. And what I mean by this is they're like Rorschach test, right? If you're determined to see this as um, a story about Tom and this and that about him, you're going to see that. But if you're willing to just sit back and look and just take it all in, I think there's so much complexity and nuance to everything that goes on throughout the 10 episodes. And those are the kind of docs that I like to watch, and hopefully the kind that other people like to watch too.
So we only got 5 minutes left or so. So I have a couple more questions
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah,
to close things out. I'm really curious about the Hernandez episode, and
yeah.
with what you just said about these films that build from the verite and tell a story. It's a story everyone knows, is aware about. And I'm sure for you, as someone that wasn't a sports person, this is probably like a thing you're like, well, not sports person, but a Patriots fan. That like, oh, this is the big thing that everyone knows that happened. And you have to reinterpret it in a way. I
Right.
found like the archive and the bit of verite, the stuff with the NFL training program and Chris Carter, like you're building a story that no one actually knew. Everyone know this guy did this thing, but this internal story is just
Yeah.
amazing. Can you talk about the approach on that?
Yeah, well, just you mentioned the archive. Just to give you a sense, it was 30,000 hours of footage, just in the Patriot archive alone, right? So that's two Mack trucks filled up with tapes the size of like credit cards, basically. And just to go through that was insane. But you talk about that Chris Carter sequence where, Chris Carter, a Hall of Fame wide receiver, is giving a speech to the rookie at the rookie symposium. And those are those moments that change an entire episode structure when you see them, because you're like, well, nobody's ever seen something like this. I didn't even know that the NFL had that now, but I've learned since then that they, like, I think I've actually heard that Ray Lewis is now doing those for the incoming rookies, which is fascinating, and sends me in many different directions, which is, and it also is great that that's happening. But with the Hernandez episode, I think the thing to me is that, yes, there had been a doc series about Hernandez before. There had been books and articles. The Spotlight team at the Boston Globe, who uncovered all the Catholic priest stuff in Boston and beyond, had already done a piece about Hernandez, and that's who we interviewed as our journalist here. But what I realized is that, yes, there was this tragedy that had happened with this story, but when you look at Dion Branch talking, there is still so much love for this guy, and they care about him in a way that is really complicated and nuanced. It's not simple. It's not like we're going to do the true crime version of this story, right? And that is immediately what I got. And so, my entire philosophy and the way I made this thing was, I'm going to step out of the way and let these guys tell the stories. But in this episode in particular, it was just like, okay, there's a lot longer takes with people just talking and being on camera and just letting it unfold, because I don't think anybody outside of that building really knew what it was like to be around that guy. And I just wanted to let that play itself out.
Very well said. Well, I mean, this is my last thing, and you can opine on this how you want, and don't
Yeah.
toot your own horn too much, but feel free. There's a lot of these big sweeping things that are covering the history, especially now, of whatever sports team or figure,
Yeah.
and they say a lot. I don't know if any more inspirations for you, but where do you feel like this story and what you and your team have done with it sit in the pantheon of these
Oh
awesome,
man.
great sports epics?
That is not for me to say, unfortunately. I think what I can tell you is that we grinded away at this. And I know everybody in documentary works really, really hard, and they do, but this is one that, you know, there were a lot of 20-hour days on this one. And I mean that, like, working until 4 o'clock in the morning on the edit, and traveling all over the country. And even though we weren't all Patriot fans, there's some of the people on the thing were diehard Patriot fans. Um, this was really a labor of love. And so it's a testament to Apple, and imagine that we had the resources and the time over 2.5 years and to tell the story the way that we wanted to. So all I can tell you is that we're very proud of this, and I think we got to a story that is, very human and goes well beyond a sports documentary. And I hope people that watch it feel the same way. But we're all very, very proud of the way it turned out.
Matthew Hamachek, director of Apple's The Dynasty, the New England Patriots. Matt, thank you so much for joining us on Spring
Brandon, thank you so much. I
Showcase.
appreciate it.